Miss Marple and the Garden Gate Secret. The annual St. Mary Mead Garden Competition had long been a source of pleasant rivalry among the village's more horticulturally inclined residents. This year, on a particularly fine June afternoon, it seemed that everyone who was anyone in the small English village had gathered in the expansive gardens of Gossington Hall. Lady Selina Harcourt, the newest resident of consequence, had graciously offered her grounds for the event, an act which simultaneously endeared her to the community while providing ample opportunity for everyone to scrutinize her wealth and taste. "I do believe Mrs. Blackett has outdone herself with those dahlias," remarked Miss Jane Marple to her dear friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry. The elderly lady adjusted her spectacles as she peered across the lawn at the vibrant display. "Though I cannot help but notice they're positioned rather advantageously in the light. Reminds me so much of young Elsie Meadows at the church bazaar, arranging her jam jars just where the sunlight would catch them." Mrs. Bantry chuckled. "Dear Jane, you do see the most remarkable parallels." Miss Marple smiled gently. At 82, her slight frame and snow-white hair gave her an appearance of such benign fragility that most people overlooked the sharp intelligence behind her pale blue eyes. She wore a neat grey dress, with a touch of lavender lace at the collar, modest, proper, and entirely unremarkable. Just as she preferred. "Colonel Templeton Green seems rather taken with our hostess," Miss Marple observed, nodding discreetly toward the retired military man, who hovered attentively near Lady Selina. The widow, elegant in a pale blue summer dress, laughed at something he said, touching his arm with a familiarity that raised eyebrows among the village matrons. "Hardly surprising," Mrs. Bantry replied. "Lady Selina isn't yet 50, still handsome, and rumoured to be quite wealthy after her husband's passing. The Colonel has been a bachelor too long." "Yes, though I believe Mr. Lawrence Redding finds her equally charming." Miss Marple indicated the handsome young artist who had recently taken up residence in the village gatehouse. He stood some distance away, apparently admiring an ornamental fountain, though his eyes frequently strayed to their hostess. The gathering was at its height, when the judges, Reverend Leonard Clement, Dr. Haydock, and Mr. Petherick the solicitor, huddled together to make their final deliberations. Competitors attempted to appear nonchalant, while casting anxious glances at their exhibits. Lady Selina moved gracefully through the crowd, the perfect hostess, though Miss Marple noted she seemed to avoid young Mrs. Crabtree, whose husband managed the Harcourt estate. "I do wonder," Miss Marple murmured, "why Lady Selina hired an estate manager so quickly after moving here. The previous owner managed quite well without one." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack from the neighbouring town of Much Benham. His unexpected appearance caused a ripple of curiosity among the guests. "Whatever is Slack doing here?" Mrs. Bantry wondered. "Surely he hasn't come to judge the roses." The inspector's grim expression suggested something far more serious than horticultural matters. He conferred briefly with Dr. Haydock, whose face grew grave. Together they approached Lady Selina, speaking in low tones. The colour drained from her face. "Something is very wrong," Miss Marple observed, her expression concerned. As if to confirm her suspicion, a piercing scream suddenly cut through the pleasant afternoon chatter. All heads turned toward the walled kitchen garden, where a young maid stood at the entrance, her hands pressed to her mouth in horror. "Oh, in there, behind the garden gate. It's Mr. Crabtree. He's—" The girl could not finish, but the message was clear. Dr. Haydock pushed through the curious onlookers, followed closely by Inspector Slack. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry exchanged glances. The garden competition was forgotten, as whispers raced through the crowd. "Did she say Mr. Crabtree?" "The estate manager. But he was just here an hour ago." Miss Marple made her way quietly to a stone bench with a view of the kitchen garden gate. From this vantage point, she observed the faces of those gathered, their shock, their curiosity, and in one case, something that might have been relief quickly masked by appropriate concern. When Dr. Haydock emerged from the garden, his expression confirmed what many had already guessed. "I'm afraid there's been a most unfortunate incident," he announced solemnly. "Mr. Edward Crabtree is dead. The circumstances are suspicious. Inspector Slack has requested that everyone remain until they can be interviewed." A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by an explosion of theories and exclamations. In the ensuing chaos, Few noticed Miss Marple's thoughtful expression as she watched Mrs. Crabtree sink into a chair, her young face a mask of shocked disbelief. Or perhaps something else entirely. "How dreadful," Mrs. Bantry whispered, returning to Miss Marple's side. "They've only been married a year. She was the governess for his children from his first marriage, you know." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "And now the young widow of a wealthy man. Reminds me of the Simmons case in Little Hadley, though perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself." She folded her hands in her lap and settled in to observe. The pleasant garden party had transformed into something altogether different, and Miss Marple knew from experience that in the hours to come, the seeds of truth would begin to sprout among the tangled weeds of village gossip and speculation. By evening, the news of Edward Crabtree's death had spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. Miss Marple sat by her front window, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she observed the unusual bustle on the normally quiet lane. Neighbors called on neighbors, their urgent expressions suggesting the exchange of theories rather than sympathy. The telephone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Mrs. Bantry, eager to share what she had learned since they had been released from Gossington Hall. "Jane, you won't believe what's being said. Inspector Slack has declared it murder, a blow to the head, with one of those decorative garden trowels from Lady Selina's collection, gold-plated and monogrammed, if you can imagine such extravagance." "How dreadful," Miss Marple replied. "Both the manner of death and the ruination of what must have been a lovely garden implement. They're saying he was killed around 2 o'clock, when everyone was gathered for the judging announcement. And Jane," Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice as though someone might overhear, "despite being alone in her drawing room, the young Mrs. Crabtree is behaving most peculiarly. Dorothy from the post office saw her just now at Mr. Petherick's office. Surely it's too soon to be discussing wills and inheritances. People manage grief differently," Miss Marple observed, "though I suppose it is rather precipitous." After Mrs. Bantry's call, Miss Marple placed her knitting in her work-basket and prepared a pot of tea. She had just settled when there was a knock at her door. It was Dr. Haydock, looking weary. "I thought you might like to know the facts before the village creates its own version," he said, accepting her offer of tea. Edward Crabtree was struck from behind, sometime between 1:30 and 2:30. The weapon was indeed one of Lady Selina's ornamental garden tools, which suggests either opportunity or premeditation on the killer's part. "Was anything taken?" Miss Marple inquired. "No, which rules out random theft. His watch and wallet remained untouched." The doctor sighed. "Slack is focusing on the wife, of course. Their marriage raised eyebrows. She's 26 to his 48, and there was talk about her relationship with his children." "People do talk so," Miss Marple said mildly. "I recall similar gossip when Mr. Jenkins, the draper, married his shop assistant. The difference being that no one murdered Mr. Jenkins," Dr. Haydock replied with a wry smile. "There's more, though Slack would have my head if he knew I was telling you. Crabtree recently changed his will, leaving everything to his new wife instead of dividing it with his children from his first marriage. The eldest son, Arthur, is particularly incensed." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple commented. "And the children? They were at the garden party?" "Arthur was, looking thunderous whenever his stepmother was nearby. The daughter, Margaret, apparently refused to attend once she learned her stepmother would be there. The next morning brought Reverend Clement to Miss Marple's door as she tended her garden. "Such a terrible business," he said after pleasantries were exchanged. "I've just come from comforting Mrs. Crabtree. The poor woman seems utterly bewildered." "I imagine she would be," Miss Marple replied. "Sudden death is always a shock, especially in such violent circumstances." "Indeed. Though between us, I found her grief somewhat performative, but perhaps that's uncharitable of me." The vicar looked troubled. "Lady Selina is distraught that her home was the scene of such a tragedy. She's considering leaving St. Mary Mead altogether." "That would be a pity after such a short residence," Miss Marple said. "I understand she knew the Crabtrees before moving here?" "Yes, from London society. In fact, I believe it was her recommendation that led to Crabtree's appointment as her estate manager. Colonel Templeton Green mentioned that they served on some charitable board together years ago." As the day progressed, Miss Marple made a point of visiting the village shops, where conversation inevitably turned to the murder. "I always thought there was something not quite right about that household," Mrs. Price at the bakery confided. "My niece works as a kitchen maid at their house, and she says Mrs. Crabtree and Mr. Lawrence Redding were often seen in deep conversation in the gardens when the master was away. At the butcher's, Mr. Baker had his own theory. It was the son, mark my words. Young Arthur was in here last week, raging about being disinherited in favor of that gold-digging opportunist. His very words, Miss Marple. By afternoon, Miss Marple had collected no fewer than 7 different theories about the murder. The most surprising came from her gardener's boy, who arrived to help with some heavy lifting in her garden. "My brother works at the garage, miss," he said as they pruned the roses. "He says Colonel Templeton Green's car was brought in last week with a peculiar dent, like it had hit something or someone. The colonel was very insistent it be fixed quickly and quietly. That evening, Inspector Slack paid Miss Marple an unexpected visit. His expression was sour, as though the very idea of consulting her was distasteful. "I'm here at the suggestion of Sir Henry Clithering," he said stiffly, referring to the former Scotland Yard Commissioner, who had often praised Miss Marple's insights. "He seems to think you might have observations worth hearing." "How kind of Sir Henry," Miss Marple replied, offering tea, which Slack declined. "I'll be direct, Miss Marple. Did you notice anything unusual at the garden party? Anything that might not have seemed significant at the time?" Miss Marple considered for a moment. "I did notice that Mr. Crabtree seemed agitated when speaking with Lady Selina near the rose garden. She appeared to be reassuring him about something, but he kept glancing toward his wife, who was in conversation with young Mr. Redding." Slack's eyebrows raised slightly. "Anything else?" "Well, it's probably nothing, but shortly before the discovery, I saw Colonel Templeton Green returning from the direction of the kitchen garden. He was straightening his tie and looked rather flushed. I assumed he had been admiring the vegetables, though it seemed an odd time to do so." The inspector made a note. "We'll look into it. Thus far, everyone claims to have been watching the judges announce the winners, but clearly, someone slipped away." After Slack left, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her mind not on the pattern, but on the tangled web of relationships that had been revealed. There was young Mrs. Crabtree, possibly involved with Lawrence Redding. Arthur Crabtree, angry about his inheritance. Lady Selina, who had some prior connection to the deceased. And Colonel Templeton Green. Its car might have been involved in a different incident altogether. "It reminds me," she murmured to herself, "of the case of the vicar's missing watch. Everyone looked in the obvious places, but it was in the most unexpected location all along." As darkness fell over the village, Miss Marple made a decision. Tomorrow, she would pay a call on Mrs. Crabtree. Not to offer condolences, others would do that, but to observe. For in murder cases, Miss Marple had learned, it was not what people said that mattered, but what they did not say, and how they did not say it. The Crabtree residence, Wisteria Lodge, stood on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead. Not as grand as Gossington Hall, but substantial enough to indicate prosperity. Miss Marple approached it the following morning, a small basket of fresh scones on her arm, as pretext for her visit. The maid who answered the door seemed flustered. "Mrs. Crabtree is receiving only family today, miss." "Oh dear, I quite understand," Miss Marple said apologetically. "I only brought these freshly baked scones, my small way of offering comfort. Perhaps you could give them to her with my card." As the maid hesitated, voices rose from within, a man's angry and insistent, followed by a woman's tearful response. The maid glanced nervously over her shoulder. "That would be Mr. Arthur, the son," she whispered. "Been at it all morning, he has. Please wait here." Left alone in the entrance hall, Miss Marple took the opportunity to observe her surroundings. Family photographs adorned a side table. Edward Crabtree, stern-faced but handsome, his 2 adult children from his first marriage, and most recently added, his young second wife Helena. In one wedding photograph, Miss Marple noticed Lady Selina among the guests, standing prominently near the bride. The argument grew louder.
"You've been planning this from the start."
Arthur's voice carried clearly. "Dad changes his will just months after marrying you, and now he's conveniently dead."
"I'm not a fool, Helena."
"How dare you? I loved your father." The voices hushed abruptly as a door opened. The maid reappeared, followed by Mrs. Helena Crabtree herself. Despite her widow's black dress, she looked remarkably composed. though her eyes were red-rimmed. "Miss Marple, how thoughtful of you to call," she said with careful politeness. "Please, do come in for a moment." She led Miss Marple to a small morning room, away from wherever Arthur Crabtree was presumably still fuming. Once seated, Helena managed a wan smile. "You must forgive the disturbance. Grief affects us all differently." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said sympathetically. "Such a terrible shock for you all." "The police have been most intrusive," Helena continued, her fingers nervously twisting her handkerchief. "Inspector Slack seems determined to believe the worst of everyone." "He is rather thorough," Miss Marple agreed. "I understand your husband's death occurred during the judging announcement." "Yes, I was right there in the crowd. Everyone saw me." The widow's response came too quickly, too defensively. "A dreadful coincidence," Miss Marple murmured. "I believe you knew Lady Selina before coming to St. Mary Mead." Helena looked startled by the change in subject. "Yes, we served on a charitable committee in London. She was very kind to recommend Edward for the position when her estate manager retired. Such a fortunate connection. And Mr. Redding, the artist. I believe I've seen him calling here." A flash of something alarm crossed Helena's face. "Lawrence has been commissioned to paint my portrait. Edward arranged it as a birthday gift. It's unfinished now, of course." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Arthur Crabtree, a tall man in his early 30s, with his father's stern features. "Paying your respects, Miss Marple?" he asked coldly. "How good of you, when so many in the village are whispering rather than offering condolences." "Arthur, please," Helena began, but he cut her off. "No need for pretense. I'm sure Miss Marple has heard the gossip. My father's convenient death, the changed will, my stepmother's friendships." "Arthur, Miss Marple doesn't need to hear. I think the whole village needs to hear the truth," he snapped. "How you manipulated my father, turned him against his own children, and now stand to inherit everything while we're left with nothing." Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. "If I might say, Mr. Crabtree, in my experience, moments of grief often bring out feelings that may seem disproportionate to others. Perhaps what you need is—" "What I need," Arthur interrupted, "is justice for my father." He turned to Helena. "The police may be satisfied with questioning you once, but I promise you, this isn't over." He stormed out, leaving an uncomfortable silence. "You must think us terribly dysfunctional," Helena said quietly. "Families often are, my dear, especially in times of stress." Miss Marple rose to leave. "I won't intrude any longer." As she was shown out, Miss Marple noticed Lawrence Redding's figure retreating through the garden gate at the rear of the property. The maid followed her gaze. "Mr. Redding came to pay his respects too," she explained hastily. "He's been ever so concerned for Mrs. Crabtree." "Quite natural," Miss Marple replied, though she noted the artist had apparently preferred to leave unseen. Instead of returning directly home, Miss Marple took a circuitous route that led her past Colonel Templeton Green's cottage. The colonel was in his front garden, examining his prize roses with a magnifying glass. "Miss Marple," he called cheerfully upon spotting her. "How delightful. Would you care to see my new Duchess of Windsor variety? Only just blooming." She accepted the invitation, allowing the colonel to show her his blooms while she observed him carefully. Unlike many in the village, he seemed untouched by the recent tragedy. "You're acquainted with Mr. Crabtree, I believe?" she inquired innocently. "Barely knew the fellow," the colonel replied. "Met him through Lady Selina's gatherings, of course, but we had little in common. Military men and business types rarely do. Yet I thought I saw you in deep conversation with him at the garden party near the refreshment tent." The colonel's hand trembled slightly as he dead-headed a rose. "Did you? I don't recall specifically. Spoke to many people that day before the unpleasantness. Of course. And afterwards, you were questioned by Inspector Slack like the rest of us?" "Naturally. Standard procedure. Nothing to contribute, I'm afraid. I was watching the judges announce the winners for the herbaceous borders. My specialty, you know." "Indeed," Miss Marple smiled. "Though I thought the winners were being announced near the sundial, while you seemed to be coming from the direction of the kitchen garden shortly before the discovery." The colonel straightened, his expression guarded. "My dear Miss Marple, in the confusion of the day, perhaps you misremember. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have correspondence awaiting my attention." His abrupt dismissal was telling. As Miss Marple continued her walk, she passed the village post office, where she encountered the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement. "Have you heard the latest?" Mrs. Clement whispered excitedly. "Inspector Slack has been asking about Lady Selina's London background. Apparently, there was some financial scandal involving her late husband, and would you believe it, Edward Crabtree was somehow connected to it." "How interesting," Miss Marple replied. "And yet she specifically brought him to manage her estate." "Precisely. Dorothy at the post office overheard Lady Selina on the telephone yesterday, sounding most distressed. Something about if this comes out, we're both ruined." Talking to her solicitor, one assumed. By the time Miss Marple reached home, her mind was busy cataloguing these new pieces of information. She was just settling with her knitting when her telephone rang again. It was Dr. Haydock. "Miss Marple, I thought you should know. The autopsy revealed something unexpected. Edward Crabtree was already dying, advanced heart disease. He might have had 6 months at most. Slack is keeping it quiet for now, but it adds an interesting dimension, doesn't it?" After hanging up, Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting forgotten in her lap. A dying man, a changed will, old London connections, a young wife with possible romantic entanglements, and an angry disinherited son. "It reminds me," she murmured to herself, "of the Simmons brothers and the missing inheritance. Everyone was so focused on who would gain, they never considered who stood to lose the most." She picked up her knitting again, her needles clicking rhythmically as her mind sorted through the tangled threads of motives, opportunities, and secrets that wove through the seemingly peaceful village of St. Mary Mead. The next morning dawned grey and drizzly, matching the sombre mood that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple was tending to her indoor plants when her telephone rang once more. It was Mrs. Bantry, her voice pitched with excitement. "Jane, you simply must come to tea this afternoon. Inspector Slack has made an arrest." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "So quickly. Who has been arrested, Dolly?" "Lawrence Redding, the artistic young man who's been painting all the village ladies. They took him in early this morning. The whole village is in an uproar." By the time Miss Marple arrived at Gossington Hall that afternoon, Mrs. Bantry had gathered additional details, which she shared eagerly as they sat in her drawing room. They found the murder weapon hidden in his studio, that ornamental garden trowel, still with traces of blood, despite someone's attempt to clean it. And there's more. Apparently, he and Helena Crabtree have been carrying on a love affair for months. The maid gave a statement saying she'd seen them embracing in the garden when Edward was away on business. "I see," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "And his whereabouts during the garden party?" "He claims he was sketching by the lake when the murder occurred, but no one can confirm it. Most convenient, wouldn't you say? And now with Edward gone, and Helena set to inherit everything, it does appear rather incriminating," Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested reservation. Their tea was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Templeton Green, who had come to discuss a parish matter with Mrs. Bantry, but couldn't resist joining the conversation about the arrest. "Seems an open and shut case," he declared confidently. "Young artist, passionate temperament, illicit affair with a wealthy man's wife. It's a tale as old as time, though perhaps solved a little too neatly," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "I wonder why Mr. Redding would hide the murder weapon in his own studio, where it would surely be found in any police investigation." The colonel shifted uncomfortably. "Panic, most likely. Criminals often make elementary mistakes in the aftermath." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple agreed, her gaze resting thoughtfully on the colonel's face. "By the way, I do hope your car has been repaired satisfactorily. Your gardener's boy mentioned you had some damage attended to recently." A flash of alarm crossed the colonel's face before he composed himself. "A minor scrape. Nothing of consequence." "Ah, is that the time? I really must be going." After he departed hastily, Mrs. Bantry looked curiously at her friend. "What was that about his car, Jane?" "Merely gathering information," Miss Marple replied with a small smile. "Now tell me, has Lady Selina commented on the arrest?" "That's another curious thing. She's left for London suddenly. Urgent business, apparently. Most peculiar timing, especially when her home was the scene of the crime." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where she found Reverend Clement in his study. After some general conversation, she gently steered the topic to Lawrence Redding's arrest. "I've just come from visiting Mrs. Crabtree," the vicar said, looking troubled. "She's devastated by Mr. Redding's arrest. Claims he's entirely innocent and that their relationship was purely professional. And, do you believe her?" The vicar hesitated. "As a man of God, I should not presume to judge. But, no, I'm not entirely convinced. There was something too rehearsed about her protestation." "I understand Mr. Redding was painting her portrait," Miss Marple said. "Had he painted others in the village?" "Yes, Lady Selina commissioned him first, which is how he came to be known locally. Then there was Mrs. Crabtree, and I believe he was discussing a portrait of Colonel Templeton Green as well." "How interesting that his path seems to cross with all our principal figures," Miss Marple observed. "Has Inspector Slack spoken with Arthur Crabtree since the arrest?" "I believe so, though Arthur seems unsatisfied with the conclusion. He was at the police station this morning, quite vocal about his suspicions, still centering on his stepmother." As Miss Marple left the vicarage, she encountered Dr. Haydock, making house calls. He paused to greet her. "I hear Slack has his man," he said quietly. "Though between us, I'm not convinced. The timing of the blow doesn't quite align with Redding's known movements that day." "Oh?" Miss Marple's interest was piqued. "How so?" The garden party began at noon. Redding was seen by multiple guests near the main terrace, until at least 1:30. The cause of death was a single powerful blow to the back of the head, likely causing instant death, yet rigor mortis indicated death occurred closer to 2 o'clock, during the judging announcements when most guests were gathered on the lawn, making it difficult for Redding to have committed the murder and returned to be seen publicly, Miss Marple concluded. "Precisely, and there's another detail Slack is overlooking. The blow was delivered with considerable force, suggesting someone of substantial physical strength. While Mr. Redding is rather slightly built," Miss Marple mused, "more suited to holding a paintbrush than wielding a garden implement with deadly force." That evening, Miss Marple sat in her garden, despite the light drizzle, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The factual evidence pointed to Lawrence Redding. Yet something felt amiss. The convenient discovery of the weapon, the obvious motive. It was all rather too perfect, like a badly constructed detective novel, where the author plants obvious clues. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Henry Clithering, the former Scotland Yard Commissioner, who occasionally visited his nephew in St. Mary Mead. "I thought I might find you pondering this case," he said, accepting the chair she offered. "Inspector Slack seems quite satisfied with his arrest." "Perhaps too satisfied," Miss Marple replied. "It's all very neat, isn't it? The artist, the affair, the inheritance. Yet I keep thinking of something my grandnephew said about magic tricks, that one should watch not the hand performing the flourish, but the other hand, the one distracting attention. And what hand is distracting us here?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," Miss Marple admitted. "But consider this. Edward Crabtree was already dying, though few knew it. His will was changed to benefit his new wife entirely. His son was furious about the disinheritance. Lady Selina had some previous connection to Crabtree that she's been reluctant to discuss. And Colonel Templeton Green has been strangely nervous since the murder." Sir Henry listened attentively. "You suspect someone other than Redding?" "I merely observe that in village life, as in murder, the simplest explanation is not always the correct one. Take Mrs. Finch's missing pearls last year. Everyone suspected the new housemaid, but it was actually the old gardener, trusted for 30 years, who had developed a gambling problem. And what does your instinct tell you about this case?" Miss Marple hesitated. "That we're dealing with something from the past, rather than the present. Edward Crabtree's death seems connected to something that happened long before he came to St. Mary Mead. Something involving Lady Selina, perhaps. Have you shared these thoughts with Slack?" "Inspector Slack is not particularly receptive to elderly ladies' intuitions," Miss Marple said with a small smile. "He prefers concrete evidence, like a blood-stained trowel, convenient enough to incriminate the most obvious suspect." As Sir Henry prepared to leave, he paused. "I'll be in London tomorrow. Any particular inquiries you'd like me to make discreetly?" "As a matter of fact," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling, I would be most interested in any past financial connections between the late Lord Harcourt, Lady Selina's husband, and Edward Crabtree. And perhaps any mention of Colonel Templeton Green in relation to either of them. Consider it done, Miss Marple. I suspect Inspector Slack may have arrested his man with undue haste. I'll telephone you when I return. After Sir Henry departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, but her mind remained on the case. Lawrence Redding might well have been involved with Helena Crabtree, but something told her he was not a killer, or at least not the killer of Edward Crabtree. The answer, she murmured to herself, lies not in what we've seen, but in what we haven't. Like Mrs. Wilkins' strawberry jam, everyone thought it was particularly fine, but no one asked why she suddenly had access to so many strawberries when her own plants had failed that year. The question now was, what unseen element connected all these people to the death of Edward Crabtree behind the garden gate at Gossington Hall? The funeral of Edward Crabtree took place 3 days later, drawing nearly the entire village, despite the continuing grey weather. Miss Marple observed the proceedings from a respectful distance, her attention not on the coffin being lowered into the ground, but on the mourners. Helena Crabtree stood pale and composed, dressed in impeccable black, her face partially obscured by a delicate veil. Arthur Crabtree maintained a rigid posture beside his sister Margaret, who had arrived from London the previous day. Their faces showed grief mixed with unmistakable anger. Lady Selina, returned from her brief London trip, stood slightly apart from the family group, her expression inscrutable. After the service, as villagers dispersed in hushed groups, Miss Marple noticed Helena drop her handkerchief. Colonel Templeton Green, who had positioned himself nearby, swiftly retrieved it for her. Their hands touched briefly during the exchange, and Miss Marple did not miss the meaningful glance that passed between them. How very interesting, she murmured to herself. That afternoon, Miss Marple received the anticipated call from Sir Henry Clithering, who had returned from London with the information she had requested.
"Most illuminating, my dear Miss Marple," he began. "Edward Crabtree was indeed connected to the late Lord Harcourt. He was his financial advisor. More significantly, there was a scandal just before Lord Harcourt's death involving misappropriation of funds from several estates he managed, including a substantial sum from a regimental fund."
And Colonel Templeton Green, Miss Marple prompted. Precisely. He was treasurer of that same regimental fund. The matter was hushed up to avoid embarrassment, but substantial amounts were never recovered. Lord Harcourt died shortly thereafter, allegedly by his own hand, though there were rumours that it might not have been suicide. Indeed, Lady Selina inherited everything, cleared her husband's debts, and eventually moved to St. Mary Mead, with a somewhat diminished but still comfortable fortune. And Edward Crabtree, what became of him? He weathered the scandal, though his reputation suffered. He shifted to managing private estates rather than investment portfolios. Interestingly, he married his second wife, Helena, just months after these events. Thank you, Sir Henry. This adds a new dimension to our village tragedy. After hanging up, Miss Marple sat thoughtfully for some time. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, but it was still incomplete. She needed more information. The opportunity came sooner than expected. That evening, Miss Marple received a most unusual visitor, Margaret Crabtree, the daughter of the deceased, whom she had never formally met. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple," the young woman said, as she was shown into the sitting room. Unlike her brother, Margaret spoke softly, her manner reserved. "Reverend Clement suggested I speak with you. He seems to think you have insight into what's happened." "The Reverend is too kind," Miss Marple replied, modestly. "Please, sit down. How may I help you, Miss Crabtree?" Margaret hesitated, twisting her gloves in her hands. "I don't believe Lawrence Redding killed my father. The police are taking the easy route, focusing on a supposed love affair and ignoring other possibilities." "You have reason to suspect someone else?" "I have reason to suspect several people," Margaret said with sudden intensity. "My stepmother, who stands to inherit everything, Lady Selina, who had some mysterious hold over my father, even Colonel Templeton Green, who's been paying particular attention to Helena since even before father's death." "That's quite a list of suspects," Miss Marple observed. "May I ask what brought you to these conclusions?" Margaret reached into her handbag and withdrew a small notebook. "This was my father's. I found it in his desk at home, when I was looking for insurance papers." She handed it to Miss Marple. The last few entries are disturbing. Miss Marple opened the notebook carefully. It was a simple diary, with brief entries in a cramped, methodical handwriting. She turned to the final pages. May 10, S demands more money. Impossible. Threatened to tell H about London. May 12, meeting with CTG. Warned him to stay away from H. He laughed. May 15, H acting strangely. Suspect something? Must speak with S before the garden party.
June 1, evidence secured. Safety deposit box, key with P.
If anything happens to me, the entry ended there. Miss Marple looked up at Margaret, her expression grave. Have you shown this to Inspector Slack? Margaret shook her head. I wanted to understand it first. Hess must be Lady Selina. Hess is Helena, my stepmother. And CTG would be Colonel Templeton Green. But what evidence? And who is Mr. Petherick? Perhaps. The solicitor, Miss Marple suggested. Your father might have entrusted something to him. That makes sense, Margaret agreed. But why would Lady Selina demand money from father? And what happened in London that she could hold over him? Miss Marple considered her next words carefully. Your father was Lord Harcourt's financial advisor, was he not? There was some difficulty just before his lordship's death. Margaret looked startled. Yes, though it was all very hushed up. Father never spoke of it. How did you know? Village gossip has a way of connecting to wider circles, Miss Marple said evasively. Did your father seem worried in the weeks before his death? Increasingly so. At first, I thought it was his health. He'd been to specialists in London, though he wouldn't discuss the results. But looking back, he seemed more afraid than ill. Margaret's voice faltered. Miss Marple, I believe my father knew he was in danger. And the safety deposit box? Have you inquired about it? Not yet. I was planning to visit Mr. Petherick tomorrow. Margaret retrieved the diary and rose to leave. Thank you for listening. Arthur is so consumed with anger at Helena that he can't think clearly. I needed someone objective. After Margaret departed, Miss Marple made a decision. She reached for her telephone and placed a call to Mr. Petherick's residence. I apologize for disturbing your evening, she began, when the elderly solicitor answered. But I wonder if we might meet tomorrow regarding the Crabtree matter. There may be something requiring your professional attention. The following morning found Miss Marple at Mr. Petherick's office, ahead of her appointed time. As she waited in the reception area, she overheard voices from an adjacent room. Helena Crabtree's distinctive tones, raised in evident distress. But it must be processed immediately. I need access to those accounts. Mr. Petherick's measured response was too low to discern, but Helena's reply was clear enough. The police have the wrong man. I need to hire a proper solicitor for Lawrence, and that requires funds. Surely as Edward's widow, I have rights. The door opened abruptly, and Helena emerged, her composure visibly shaken. She stopped short at the sight of Miss Marple. Miss Marple, I didn't expect. Are you here about Edward's affairs as well? Just a small matter of a charity donation he had promised St. John's Auxiliary. Miss Marple improvised smoothly. Nothing that can't wait. You seem distressed, my dear. Helena's laugh was brittle. Wouldn't you be? My husband is murdered. My friend is wrongfully imprisoned. And now I discover I can't access our funds until some legal technicalities are resolved. Most inconvenient, Miss Marple sympathized. Especially when one has pressing needs, like securing legal representation for Mr. Redding. Something flickered in Helena's eyes. Yes, well, Edward would have wanted me to help Lawrence. They were friends, despite what the gossips say. After Helena left, Mr. Petherick welcomed Miss Marple into his office. When she mentioned the diary and the reference to a safety deposit box, the solicitor's expression grew grave. Edward did entrust a key to me, just a week before his death. He said I was to give it to his children, both of them together. He emphasized in the event of his death. He seemed troubled. Do you know what the key unlocks? A box at Barclays in Much Benham. I've been waiting for an appropriate moment to inform Arthur and Margaret. Given the circumstances, I thought it best to wait until after the funeral. Miss Crabtree is planning to visit you today about this very matter, Miss Marple informed him. It might be wise to ensure both siblings are present when the box is opened. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, a final question occurred to her. Mr. Petherick, was Edward aware of his heart condition? Dr. Haydock mentioned he had been seriously ill. The solicitor looked surprised. Yes, quite aware. He consulted me about adjusting his will in light of the diagnosis. 6 months at most, the specialists gave him, a great shock for a man of his age, and yet he made no provision for his children in that revised will. That, said Mr. Petherick carefully, was a point of considerable discussion between us. He was most insistent that everything go to Helena, though I counselled, including some allowance for Arthur and Margaret. Walking home, Miss Marple's mind turned over this new information. Edward Crabtree, knowing he was dying, had still felt threatened enough to secure evidence in a safety deposit box. Lady Selina had been demanding money and threatening to reveal something about London. Colonel Templeton Green had been warned away from Helena and now appeared to be consoling the widow, despite Lawrence Redding supposedly being her lover. And the final puzzling detail, if Edward had only months to live due to his heart condition, why would anyone risk murder to hasten his death? Unless, Miss Marple realized with sudden clarity, the murder wasn't about hastening his death at all, but about preventing him from revealing something that would have been far more damaging than any scandal from the past. The contents of Edward Crabtree's safety deposit box caused a sensation in the Petherick law offices later that day. Miss Marple, having been invited to attend at Margaret Crabtree's insistence, watched the scene unfold with quiet attentiveness. Arthur and Margaret Crabtree sat side by side opposite Mr. Petherick's desk as the elderly solicitor carefully opened the metal box. Retrieved from Barclays Bank, inside were several documents, a small notebook similar to the diary Margaret had found, and most surprisingly, a sealed envelope addressed simply to the police in the event of my death by unnatural causes. Good heavens, Mr. Petherick murmured, holding up the envelope. Edward clearly feared the worst. Open it, Arthur demanded, his face flushed with emotion. If that contains proof against Helena, I'm afraid I cannot, the solicitor interrupted firmly. This is clearly intended for the authorities. I must contact Inspector Slack immediately. While Mr. Petherick stepped out to telephone the police station, the Crabtree siblings examined the other contents. The notebook contained detailed financial records, with numerous references to payments made to Sewi over the past year. Selina Harcourt, Margaret whispered, looking up at Miss Marple. Father was paying her blackmail. So it would appear, Miss Marple agreed. Though the question remains for what? Arthur had turned his attention to another document, a private investigator's report dated just 3 weeks earlier. This is about Helena, he said, his voice a mixture of vindication and shock. Father had her investigated. It says here she's been meeting regularly with Colonel Templeton Green. Not Lawrence Redding at all. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. How very interesting. Before they could explore further, Mr. Petherick returned with news that Inspector Slack was on his way. The group waited in tense silence until the inspector arrived, accompanied by a constable. Slack's expression darkened as he was shown the envelope and briefed on the other contents. This changes everything, he muttered, breaking the seal. Inside was a letter in Edward Crabtree's handwriting, along with photographs and bank statements. As Slack read the letter, his face grew increasingly grave. I'll need to take all of this into evidence, he announced. Mr. Petherick, I'll require statements from everyone present. Miss Marple, while I appreciate your interest in the case, this is now official police business. Of course, Inspector, Miss Marple replied mildly, though perhaps I might be permitted to ask, does Mr. Crabtree's letter suggest his death might not have been the straightforward crime of passion you've been investigating? Slack's mouth tightened. It appears there are complications. That's all I'm at liberty to say at this time. He turned to Arthur and Margaret. I'll need to speak with both of you at the station. As everyone prepared to leave, Margaret touched Miss Marple's arm. It was about the regimental fund scandal, she whispered hurriedly. Father wrote that Lady Selina knew he had evidence that her husband was murdered, not a suicide. And Helena, she wasn't having an affair with Lawrence Redding, but with the Colonel. Father discovered it just before he died. This information, coupled with what Miss Marple had already pieced together, formed a more complete picture in her mind. But several crucial elements were still missing. That evening, Miss Marple was surprised by another visitor, Lawrence Redding himself, freshly released from police custody, looking haggard but relieved. "Inspector Slack suggested I speak with you," he said, accepting her offer of tea. "He mentioned you had insights that might help clarify matters." "Did he indeed?" Miss Marple couldn't hide her surprise at Slack's acknowledgement. "How uncharacteristic of him." Lawrence smiled wanly. "I believe his exact words were that you have an irritating habit of being right about people's motivations." High praise from Slack. Miss Marple poured the tea before asking, "Were you aware of Mrs. Crabtree's relationship with Colonel Templeton Green?" Lawrence nodded. "Helena confided in me. We became friends when I was painting her portrait. Nothing more. Despite the village gossip, she was unhappy in her marriage and found comfort in the Colonel's attention. And the garden trowel found in your studio, planted, obviously. I've never seen it before. Someone wanted me to take the blame." His expression hardened. "I have my suspicions about who." "Lady Selina," Miss Marple suggested quietly. Lawrence looked startled. "How did you know?" "Various little indications. She recommended you to paint several portraits locally, did she not? Yet she abruptly left for London after the murder, despite her home being the crime scene, and she had some hold over Edward Crabtree, dating back to financial irregularities in London." "It goes deeper than that," Lawrence said, lowering his voice. "Helena told me that Edward married her partly as a cover. He was deeply involved in some financial scheme with Lord Harcourt years ago. Something that went terribly wrong. Lord Harcourt was found dead supposedly by suicide, but Edward believed Lady Selina had arranged his murder. And Edward had proof of this. He claimed to. That's why Lady Selina followed him to St. Mary Mead. To keep him close, to monitor him. The position as her estate manager was a form of control. This confirmation of Miss Marple's suspicions was interrupted by another ring at her door. It was Inspector Slack, looking uncharacteristically unsettled. "Ah, Redding, you're here too. Good. Saves me finding you later." He accepted Miss Marple's offer to join them. "We've had developments. Lady Selina has disappeared." "Disappeared?" Miss Marple echoed. "Left her house in a hurry after a telephone call this afternoon. Her maid reported she seemed frightened." Slack's eyes narrowed. "The call came just after I attempted to contact her about Crabtree's letter." "She's running," Lawrence said simply. "So it would seem. But there's more." Slack turned to Miss Marple. "Mrs. Crabtree and Colonel Templeton Green were seen arguing heatedly near the village pond. An hour ago, the Colonel stormed off toward his cottage, and Mrs. Crabtree was in tears. Lovers' quarrel," Lawrence suggested. "Perhaps," Slack replied. "Or something more significant. Given what we now know about multiple connections between these individuals." He hesitated, then made a decision. "Miss Marple, I'm reluctant to admit it, but your observations have proven valuable. Crabtree's letter confirms financial impropriety involving the late Lord Harcourt, himself, and Colonel Templeton Green. It also suggests Lady Selina may have been involved in her husband's death. How civilized of you to acknowledge it." "Inspector," Miss Marple said with a hint of amusement, "may I ask if Edward Crabtree specified who he feared might cause his death by unnatural causes?" "He had suspicions about Lady Selina primarily, though he also mentioned concerns about his wife's relationship with the Colonel." Slack stood up abruptly. "I need to find Lady Selina before she leaves the country, and I want to speak with the Colonel again." After Slack departed, Lawrence remained thoughtful. "It's strange," he mused. Helena seemed genuinely devastated by Edward's death, yet according to his letter, he suspected her involvement. "People are complex, Mr. Redding," Miss Marple replied. "Even in a small village like St. Mary Mead, we've seen many cases where love and resentment coexist. Mrs. Pinkerton, for instance, wept genuine tears at her husband's funeral, despite having systematically poisoned him over 6 months." Lawrence looked disturbed by the comparison. "You don't think, Helena—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that there are still pieces of this puzzle we haven't seen clearly. Edward Crabtree was already dying, remember? His murder accomplished little that natural causes wouldn't have achieved within months. Unless there was something he planned to reveal before his natural death," Lawrence suggested. "Something that couldn't wait 6 months." "Precisely." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. And now I must ask you a rather important question, Mr. Redding. On the day of the garden party, where were you really between 1:30 and 2:30? Lawrence's expression shifted subtly. I told the police, yes, that you were sketching by the lake. But no one saw you there, did they? After a moment's hesitation, Lawrence sighed. No, I was actually meeting someone in the village. Nothing to do with the murder, but personal. I didn't mention it because it would have complicated matters unnecessarily. I see. Miss Marple's tone was neutral, but her gaze was penetrating. Well, Mr. Redding, I believe the truth has a way of emerging eventually, however inconvenient its timing. After Lawrence left, Miss Marple sat in contemplation, arranging the facts as she knew them. Edward Crabtree, dying of heart disease, had secured evidence of past financial crimes involving Lady Selina, her late husband, and possibly Colonel Templeton Green. His young wife was involved with the colonel. Lady Selina had been blackmailing Crabtree, but now she had fled, suggesting she feared exposure of an even greater crime, perhaps her husband's murder. The garden trowel in Lawrence's studio was clearly planted, but by whom? And why frame the artist rather than Helena or the colonel, who had more obvious motives? Like Mrs. Henderson's stolen brooch, Miss Marple murmured to herself. Everyone assumed the chambermaid took it because she had opportunity, but it was actually Mrs. Henderson's own daughter-in-law, whom no one suspected because she seemed to have no need for it. The telephone interrupted her thoughts. It was Mrs. Bantry. Jane, you won't believe what's happening. Colonel Templeton Green is being taken to the police station in handcuffs. Half the village is watching from their windows. Whatever can it mean? Miss Marple listened to her friend's excitement, her own mind working rapidly. Did you notice if he appeared surprised by the arrest, Dolly? Not surprised so much as resigned. Oh, Jane, do you think he killed poor Mr. Crabtree after all? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that we may be approaching the truth, though perhaps not the truth everyone expects. The arrest of Colonel Templeton Green created a fresh wave of speculation throughout St. Mary Mead. By the following morning, at least 3 contradictory versions of his confession were circulating among the villagers. Miss Marple, however, reserved judgment as she made her way to Helena Crabtree's home in response to an urgent message. She found the young widow in a state of considerable distress, pacing the morning room with quick, nervous steps. They've arrested Charles, Colonel Templeton Green, Helena said, without preamble. They think we conspired together to kill Edward. It's preposterous. Perhaps you should sit down, my dear, Miss Marple suggested gently. You appear quite overwrought. Helena sank into a chair, her composure crumbling. I don't understand any of this. First Lawrence is arrested, now Charles, and Lady Selina has vanished like a ghost. When did you first become acquainted with the colonel? Miss Marple inquired, seating herself opposite Helena. Last autumn, at one of Lady Selina's dinner parties. Edward was often busy with estate matters, and Charles was attentive. A flush colored Helena's cheeks. I know what people will think, but it wasn't sordid. Edward and I had an arrangement of sorts. A marriage of convenience. He knew about Charles and tolerated it. An unusual arrangement, Miss Marple observed neutrally. Edward married me after his diagnosis. He needed someone to care for him in his final months, and I needed financial security. It was more of a business transaction than a love match. Helena's eyes filled with tears. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? But we were fond of each other, in our way. And yet he had you investigated by a private detective. Helena looked shocked. How did you? She collected herself. Yes, though not for the reasons you might think. He suspected Charles wasn't being honest with me. Edward believed Charles and Lady Selina were using me somehow. Using you? Miss Marple prompted, when Helena fell silent. To access Edward's records, perhaps. I don't really understand it all. Something about financial improprieties from years ago. Edward became increasingly paranoid in his final weeks. Miss Marple considered this. Was your husband planning to reveal something before he died? Something concerning Lady Selina or the colonel? Helena nodded slowly. He mentioned making things right before the end. He'd been gathering documents, speaking with solicitors in London. He was particularly agitated after his last visit to his heart specialist. And did he share these concerns with his children?
No.
Their relationship was already strained because of our marriage. Arthur especially resented me, blamed me for the changed will. Helena twisted her handkerchief anxiously. Miss Marple, I had nothing to do with Edward's death. Neither did Charles, despite what the police think. Yet the colonel has been arrested. Presumably Inspector Slack has evidence. Charles would never harm anyone. He was a military man, with principles. Yes, we were close, but murder. Helena shook her head vehemently. It must be a mistake. Their conversation was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of Margaret Crabtree. She entered the room with barely a nod toward Helena, her attention focused on Miss Marple. I've been looking for you, she said urgently. Something extraordinary has happened. They've found Lady Selina. Found her? Helena echoed. Where? At a hotel in Dover, preparing to sail to France. But that's not the remarkable part. Margaret's eyes gleamed with suppressed excitement. When the police searched her belongings, they discovered a letter from my father, dated the very day he died. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. What did it say? Inspector Slack wouldn't share the exact contents, but he did reveal that father had given Lady Selina an ultimatum: confess to her involvement in her husband's death, or face exposure. The letter was to be delivered to the authorities if she didn't come forward by the end of the week. Helena gasped. So Edward was killed to prevent this exposure. So it would seem, Margaret agreed, her gaze traveling coldly over her stepmother. Though who actually struck the blow remains to be determined. The police believe it was Colonel Templeton Green, acting to protect Lady Selina. Miss Marple mused. But I wonder, what? Both women looked at her expectantly. It seems rather convenient, doesn't it? Lady Selina attempting to flee the country just as the colonel is arrested. Almost as though someone wanted to ensure both were implicated. Helena rose abruptly. Are you suggesting I orchestrated this? That I somehow manipulated events to frame Charles and Lady Selina? I'm merely observing patterns, my dear, Miss Marple replied calmly. In my experience, human behavior tends to follow certain predictable courses. Much like Mrs. Emmett's prize roses, without proper pruning, they grow in unexpected directions. After leaving Wisteria Lodge, Miss Marple made her way to the police station, where she found Sir Henry Clithering in conversation with Inspector Slack. Miss Marple," Sir Henry greeted her warmly. "I was just telling the inspector about some additional information I've uncovered regarding our case." Slack looked less enthusiastic about her arrival, but nodded grudgingly. Sir Henry has been most helpful in clarifying the London connections. "It appears," Sir Henry explained, "that the late Lord Harcourt, Edward Crabtree, and Colonel Templeton Green were all involved in a complex financial scheme involving regimental funds and several estates. When it collapsed, Lord Harcourt took the blame publicly, though evidence suggests Crabtree was actually responsible for the misappropriations."
"Lord Harcourt's suicide?"
Miss Marple inquired. "Increasingly appears to have been staged," Slack admitted. "Lady Selina has been forthcoming since her apprehension. She claims Crabtree was blackmailing her with evidence that she helped cover up her husband's murder. A murder she alleges was committed by Colonel Templeton Green on Crabtree's orders. A tangled web indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And the Colonel's position now, maintaining his innocence in Crabtree's death, while admitting to an inappropriate relationship with Mrs. Crabtree, claims he was elsewhere when the murder occurred." Slack's expression suggested skepticism. "Where, precisely?" "Says he was meeting with Lawrence Redding to discuss a possible portrait commission. Convenient that both men were supposedly alone together during the critical time." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Has Mr. Redding confirmed this alibi?" "Denies it completely. Says he was in the village, as he told us before." "Most puzzling," Miss Marple commented. "If I might ask, Inspector, what physical evidence connects either Lady Selina or the Colonel to the actual murder, beyond motive and opportunity?" Slack shifted uncomfortably. "The garden trowel found in Redding's studio had the Colonel's fingerprints, partially obscured by what appears to be an attempt to wipe them off, and Lady Selina was seen near the kitchen garden shortly before the body was discovered. By whom? A kitchen maid, though the girl is somewhat unreliable. Given to flights of fancy according to the other staff." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the trowel? It was from Lady Selina's personal collection?" "Yes. kept in a glass cabinet in her conservatory, accessible to guests during the garden party. After leaving the police station, Miss Marple took a detour past Lady Selina's home, Gossington Hall. Police presence was still evident, but she managed to engage one of the gardeners in conversation. "Terrible business, miss," the old man said, shaking his head. "Can't hardly believe it, even now."
You've worked here long?
Miss Marple inquired. "Since before her ladyship bought the place, came with the property, as they say." He leaned on his rake. "Don't mind telling you, there's been strange goings-on since Mr. Crabtree started managing things. Him and her ladyship, always having private meetings, arguing sometimes. Did you happen to notice anything unusual on the day of the garden party?" The gardener scratched his chin. "Well, now that you mention it, I did see something odd. That artist fellow, Mr. Redding, slipping into the kitchen garden about an hour before the unpleasantness. Thought nothing of it at the time. Figured he was just looking for a quiet spot away from the crowd." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's interest was piqued. "Anyone else?" "The Colonel, not long after. And young Mrs. Crabtree too, though she went in a different entrance." He frowned. "Come to think of it, quite the popular spot for a vegetable garden." This new information gave Miss Marple much to consider as she walked home. Lawrence Redding had lied about his whereabouts. The Colonel claimed to have been with Redding, who denied it. Helena had also been near the scene, and Lady Selina had apparently been spotted there by a kitchen maid of questionable reliability. That evening there was a knock at Miss Marple's cottage door. She opened it to find Lawrence Redding once again on her doorstep, looking agitated. "I need to speak with you," he said without preamble. "It's about Helena." Once seated in her parlor, Lawrence revealed his concern. "I've just come from seeing her. She's planning to leave St. Mary Mead tomorrow. Says she can't bear the scrutiny and suspicion." "That seems rather hasty, with the investigation still ongoing," Miss Marple observed. "Exactly my thought. And there's something else." Lawrence hesitated. "I wasn't entirely truthful before about where I was during the murder. I was supposed to meet Helena near the kitchen garden. She'd sent me a note that morning, asking to speak privately about something urgent." "And did this meeting occur?" "No. When I arrived, I saw the Colonel entering the garden from another path. I didn't want to create a scene, so I left without Helena seeing me. At least, I thought she hadn't seen me, but now you believe she did." Lawrence nodded. "She said something today that suggested she knew I'd been there. She seemed frightened when she realized she'd let it slip." "Mr. Redding," Miss Marple said carefully, "do you believe Helena Crabtree could have been involved in her husband's death?" "I didn't want to think so," he replied slowly. "But now, with her sudden decision to leave, and the way she reacted when I mentioned being near the garden that day, I don't know what to think." After Lawrence departed, Miss Marple sat up late into the night, rearranging the pieces of the puzzle in her mind. Edward Crabtree, dying already, but determined to expose old crimes. Lady Selina, threatened with exposure. Colonel Templeton Green, involved in both the past financial scandal and a current affair with Helena. And Helena herself, in a marriage of convenience, with a financial motive of her own. Lawrence Redding's latest revelation added a new dimension. Had Helena lured him to the garden as a potential witness or a potential scapegoat? "It reminds me," Miss Marple murmured to herself, "of the Billington bank robbery. Everyone was so convinced the manager's assistant was guilty because of the obvious evidence. They completely overlooked the cleaning lady who had no apparent connection at all." Just before midnight, Miss Marple reached a decision. She picked up her telephone and placed a call to Sir Henry Clithering. "I believe," she said, when he answered, "that there's a perspective on this case which hasn't been fully explored, and I'll need your help to prove it." The following morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the dark undercurrents running through St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, dressed with particular care in her second-best grey suit with the amethyst brooch, made her way to the vicarage, where she had arranged to meet Sir Henry Clithering and Inspector Slack. "This is most irregular, Miss Marple," Slack greeted her with obvious impatience. "I have Lady Selina Harcourt and Colonel Templeton Green in custody, both implicated in Crabtree's murder. Yet you insist there are perspectives unexplored." "Indeed, Inspector," Miss Marple replied serenely. "And I believe that after our conversation, you may see matters differently." Reverend Clement had provided his study for their meeting, and once they were seated, Miss Marple began carefully. Let us consider what we know for certain. Edward Crabtree was found murdered in Lady Selina's kitchen garden during her garden party. He was struck from behind with a decorative trowel from her collection. Prior to his death, he had secured evidence relating to financial improprieties from years ago, involving Lady Selina's late husband, Colonel Templeton Green, and himself. All established facts, Slack agreed, and both Lady Selina and the Colonel had clear motives to prevent Crabtree from exposing this evidence. Yes, though it's curious that Crabtree waited so long to address these old crimes. Miss Marple mused. What changed? Sir Henry leaned forward. His diagnosis, perhaps. Facing death often prompts a desire to set one's affairs in order. Precisely, Miss Marple nodded. Edward Crabtree knew he had only months to live. This knowledge served as a catalyst for his sudden moral reckoning. But it also provides an important insight. Whoever killed him must have had a reason that couldn't wait for his natural death. Slack frowned. Both our suspects had such reasons. Lady Selina faced exposure for her role in her husband's death. The Colonel stood to lose his reputation, and possibly face criminal charges. True, Miss Marple conceded. But consider this. If their primary concern was preventing Edward from revealing their past crimes, why not simply destroy his evidence? Why resort to murder when he was already dying? Perhaps they couldn't locate the evidence, Sir Henry suggested. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said quietly, Edward Crabtree's death served another purpose entirely. One that had nothing to do with old scandals in London. She turned to Inspector Slack. Tell me, Inspector, what have you learned about the changed will? Slack consulted his notebook. Crabtree altered his will 3 months ago, leaving everything to his wife and nothing to his children from his first marriage. Given his diagnosis, his solicitor found this unusual but not illegal, and the value of his estate, considerable, around £50,000, plus the house and investments, all now belonging to Helena Crabtree, Miss Marple observed. A young woman in a marriage of convenience, with a husband who was dying slowly and a lover waiting in the wings. Sir Henry's eyebrows rose. You suspect Mrs. Crabtree? I find the timing interesting, Miss Marple replied. Edward Crabtree altered his will after learning he was dying, disinheriting his children in favor of a wife he'd married only recently. Then he hired a private detective to investigate her, specifically her relationship with Colonel Templeton Green. But the evidence against Lady Selina and the Colonel, Slack began, is largely circumstantial and surprisingly convenient, Miss Marple finished for him. A trowel from Lady Selina's collection, with the Colonel's partially white fingerprints, found in Lawrence Redding's studio. Lady Selina fleeing the country. The Colonel and Mr. Redding providing contradictory alibis. What are you suggesting? Slack demanded. Miss Marple's expression remained mild. That perhaps we should speak directly with Helena Crabtree before drawing final conclusions. I took the liberty of asking her to join us here this morning. As if on cue, there was a knock at the study door. Reverend Clement showed Helena in, looking pale but composed in a stylish black dress. Miss Marple, she greeted cautiously. Inspector. Sir Henry. The vicar said this was about new developments in Edward's case. Please sit down, Mrs. Crabtree, Miss Marple invited. We've been discussing certain aspects of your husband's death that seem somewhat perplexing. Helena took the offered seat. I'm not sure how I can help. As I've told the inspector repeatedly, I know nothing about who killed Edward. An interesting choice of words, Miss Marple commented. Most people in your position would say they don't know why someone killed their husband, but you specifically mention not knowing who, suggesting you're quite clear on the why. Helena stiffened slightly. I meant nothing particular by it. Perhaps not, Miss Marple allowed. But let's consider the facts. Your husband was dying of heart disease, with only months to live. He had changed his will to benefit you entirely. He suspected your relationship with Colonel Templeton Green and had hired a private detective to investigate. Shortly before his death, he secured evidence not only about past financial crimes, but also about your activities. This is absurd, Helena protested. Edward and I had an understanding about Charles. He wasn't concerned about our friendship. Friendship? Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. The private detective's report described something considerably more intimate. And your husband's diary expressed clear concern about the Colonel's intentions toward you. Helena's composure wavered. Whatever Edward wrote in his diary was colored by his illness. He became paranoid in his final weeks. Did he indeed? Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew a folded piece of paper. This is a copy of a letter found among Lady Selina's possessions when she was apprehended in Dover. It's from your husband, dated the day of his death. She read aloud, Selina, I now have proof of your involvement in Richard's death, and will be submitting it to the authorities by week's end. However, this is not my only concern. I've discovered disturbing information regarding Helena and Charles. Their relationship is not what it appears, nor are their intentions toward me. I believe they may be planning something more sinister than mere infidelity. If anything should happen to me before Friday, please ensure the enclosed reaches Inspector Slack. Miss Marple looked up. Curiously, the enclosure mentioned was missing when Lady Selina was found. Helena's face had drained of color. That letter proves nothing except Edward's paranoia. And why would I kill him when he was already dying? It makes no sense. Unless, Miss Marple suggested gently, you couldn't wait those few months. Perhaps because of debts? Or because the Colonel was growing impatient? Or perhaps because your husband's investigations had uncovered something you couldn't allow him to reveal? This is outrageous. Helena stood abruptly. I came here as a courtesy, but I won't sit and listen to these baseless accusations. Before you leave, Sir Henry interjected smoothly, there's one more matter. Lawrence Redding has revised his statement about his whereabouts during the garden party. He now admits he was near the kitchen garden, having received a note allegedly from you, requesting a meeting. Helena froze momentarily. He must be mistaken. I sent no such note. Yet he was there, Miss Marple pointed out, as was the Colonel, coming from another direction. And you yourself were seen entering the garden shortly before your husband's body was discovered. 3 people with connections to the victim, all converging on the murder scene at roughly the same time. Inspector Slack leaned forward. Mrs. Crabtree, did you lure both men to the garden that day? No. I mean, I did ask Charles to meet me there, but only to discuss a personal matter, and I never sent any note to Lawrence. Someone must be trying to implicate me. Or perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, you arranged for them both to be there to create confusion about who might have committed the murder. The Colonel arriving to meet you, seeing your husband instead. Lawrence, arriving moments later, witnessing something suspicious, each potentially incriminating the other. Helena's hands were trembling now. This is all speculation. You have no proof that I was involved. Miss Marple smiled slightly. As it happens, there is one piece of evidence we haven't discussed. The garden trowel used to kill your husband, a distinctive item from Lady Selina's collection. The shed where it was stored was kept locked, with only 2 keys, one held by Lady Selina herself, and one by the head gardener. Slack looked puzzled. Yes, that's correct. The gardener confirmed it. I took the liberty of speaking with him yesterday, Miss Marple continued. He mentioned something interesting, that several weeks before the murder, Lady Selina had requested a 3rd key be made, for the convenience of the estate manager, your husband. Helena's expression remained carefully neutral. I don't see how that's relevant. Don't you? A key that would have been kept at your home, accessible to you. A key that has mysteriously disappeared since your husband's death. Miss Marple paused. The gardener also mentioned seeing you practicing with those ornamental tools earlier that week, commenting on how surprisingly heavy they were for decorative items. This final revelation seemed to break something in Helena. She sank back into her chair, her carefully maintained composure crumbling. You can't possibly understand, she whispered. Edward wasn't the victim everyone believes. He was cruel, controlling. Our marriage wasn't a convenient arrangement. It was a prison. He held my past over me, threatened to expose things that would have destroyed me. When he learned he was dying, he became obsessed with punishing everyone he felt had wronged him, including you and the Colonel, Sir Henry prompted. Especially us. He knew about our relationship from the beginning. He allowed it only so he could use it against me later. The changed will was just another form of control. He knew his children would blame me, possibly even suspect me if anything happened to him. A bitter laugh escaped her. He was setting a trap, even from the grave. And Lady Selina, the Colonel, Were they also part of this trap? Slack asked. Helena's gaze dropped to her hands. Edward was using them too. He knew things about them, about what happened in London years ago. He kept evidence not to expose the truth, but to manipulate them. She looked up suddenly, her eyes desperate. I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted to talk, to beg him to leave me something of my dignity when he died. But when I found him in the garden, gloating about how he'd arranged everything so that I'd be suspected no matter when he died, I saw the trowel. It happened so quickly. And afterward? Miss Marple prompted softly. The elaborate misdirection? I panicked. I'd asked Charles to meet me there later. I knew that would cast suspicion on him. Then, I saw Lawrence hovering near the entrance. It was perfect. 3 suspects, all with reasons to want Edward dead. I took the trowel, planted it in Lawrence's studio, later that day during the confusion, and let the inevitable suspicions do the rest. Inspector Slack rose, his expression grim. Helena Crabtree, I am arresting you for the murder of Edward Crabtree. You do not have to say anything, but anything you do say. As Slack led Helena away, Sir Henry turned to Miss Marple with admiration. Remarkable, my dear. You saw through the elaborate smokescreen when everyone else was following the obvious trails. Miss Marple sighed. It reminded me of young Thomas Jenkins and the case of the missing church funds. Everyone was so convinced the evidence pointed to the curate that they overlooked the choirmaster, who had carefully arranged all the evidence to implicate him. She gathered her belongings as she prepared to leave. Human nature doesn't change, Sir Henry. Given the right circumstances, people will believe what they expect to see. Helena counted on that. Lady Selina and the Colonel's past misdeeds made them perfect scapegoats. And yet, you weren't deceived, Sir Henry observed. Perhaps because I've observed enough of human behavior to recognize when something doesn't quite fit the pattern, Miss Marple replied modestly. Like Miss Bartlett's prize-winning jam, everyone admired its perfect consistency, never questioning why it looked so different from her previous efforts. The answer, of course, was that she hadn't made it at all. As they walked out into the sunlight, the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead continued its daily routines, the residents unaware that the final piece of their most recent murder puzzle had just fallen into place behind the vicarage doors. The drawing room of Gossington Hall had been arranged for an unusual gathering. At Miss Marple's suggestion, Sir Henry Clithering had persuaded Inspector Slack to allow a final clarification of the case in the very house where the murder had originated. It was a week after Helena Crabtree's arrest, and the attendees represented all the principal figures in the tragic affair. Lady Selina Harcourt, released from custody but still under investigation for her role in her late husband's death, sat rigidly in a wingback chair. Her elegant features were drawn with strain, but she maintained the dignified composure expected of her station. Nearby, Colonel Templeton Green appeared markedly subdued, his military bearing diminished by recent events. Arthur and Margaret Crabtree occupied a small settee, their expressions a mixture of grief and lingering anger. Lawrence Redding stood somewhat apart from the others, leaning against the mantelpiece with studied casualness that didn't quite mask his discomfort. Reverend Clement and his wife were present, as were Dr. Haydock and Miss Petherick, completing the assembly of those most affected by Edward Crabtree's death. Miss Marple sat in a chair near the window, her knitting in her lap, seemingly an insignificant figure among more dramatic personalities. Yet it was to her that Inspector Slack reluctantly yielded the floor after a brief preamble about the case being resolved. Miss Marple has been instrumental in clarifying certain aspects of this investigation, he acknowledged with visible effort. Sir Henry suggested she might address any lingering questions you may have. All eyes turned to the elderly lady, who set aside her knitting with deliberate care. Thank you, Inspector, she began in her gentle voice. I'm sure we're all grateful for the diligence of the police in resolving this terrible crime. However, there are elements of the case that may still seem confusing to those involved, and perhaps I can help untangle them. She surveyed the room before continuing. The death of Edward Crabtree initially appeared to be a straightforward case. A man murdered during a public event, presumably by someone with an obvious motive. The evidence seemed to point to a crime of passion or financial gain. Yet, as we now know, the reality was both simpler and more complex. Lady Selina stirred impatiently. We all know Helena Crabtree confessed to killing her husband. What more is there to discuss? A great deal, I think, Miss Marple replied mildly. For instance, why so many of you were prepared to accept guilt or suspicion rather than reveal the full truth of your connections to Edward Crabtree. The Colonel cleared his throat uncomfortably. I'm not sure what you mean. I think you do, Colonel, Miss Marple countered gently. When you were arrested, you neither protested your innocence vigorously nor revealed what you knew about Helena's involvement. Instead, you accepted suspicion falling on you with a certain resignation. I was protecting Helena, he muttered. I loved her. I thought perhaps she had acted in desperation. A noble sentiment, Miss Marple acknowledged. But there was more to it, wasn't there? You were also protecting yourself from the exposure of past misdeeds. As was Lady Selina. Lady Selina's chin lifted defiantly. I've already provided my statement to the police regarding the unfortunate events surrounding my husband's death. That matter is separate from Edward's murder. Is it? Miss Marple questioned. I think not. Edward Crabtree's murder grew directly from seeds planted years ago in London. Financial impropriety, a suspicious suicide, blackmail, and manipulation, all forming the fertile ground for the final tragedy in Lady Selina's garden. She turned to Arthur and Margaret. Your father was not the man you believed him to be. For years, he cultivated an image of respectability while engaging in questionable financial practices. When Lord Harcourt died, not by his own hand, as was reported, but through an arrangement between Edward and possibly others, your father used that knowledge to secure his own position, and later to blackmail Lady Selina. Margaret's face had grown pale. You're saying our father was involved in Lord Harcourt's murder? The evidence suggests he was at least complicit in covering it up. Miss Marple replied gently. The documents he secured in the safety deposit box included details that implicated both himself and Lady Selina. But why would he preserve such evidence? Arthur demanded. It incriminated him as well. Insurance, Sir Henry interjected. As long as he possessed that evidence, Lady Selina could not move against him without risking exposure herself. Miss Marple nodded. A delicate balance of mutual assured destruction, maintained for years, until Edward received his diagnosis and knew his time was limited. That's when he changed, Margaret said slowly. He became obsessed with setting things right, but also with controlling everyone around him. Precisely, Miss Marple agreed. Facing death often strips away pretense. Some find redemption, others become more entrenched in their worst qualities. Edward appears to have done both simultaneously, seeking to expose old wrongs, while using that same information to manipulate those around him. She turned her attention to Lawrence Redding. You were an unwitting pawn in this game, Mr. Redding. Helena deliberately cultivated your friendship, knowing her husband was suspicious of her relationship with the Colonel. You provided a convenient alternative suspect. Lawrence frowned. She used me then. Our friendship was a lie. Not entirely, perhaps, Miss Marple replied, but she certainly recognized your value as a distraction when she needed one. The note that drew you to the garden that day, it wasn't from Helena at all, was it? Lawrence looked startled. No, though I assumed it was. It was unsigned, asking me to meet her by the kitchen garden for an urgent discussion. I presumed Helena had sent it, but you never actually saw her write it, Miss Marple pressed. And the handwriting, feminine but not distinctive. I hadn't received enough correspondence from Helena to recognize her hand specifically. Miss Marple turned to Inspector Slack. I believe if you compare the handwriting on that note with samples from Lady Selina, you'll find a match. A gasp went through the room, as all eyes turned to Lady Selina, who had gone very still. That's preposterous, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it? Miss Marple inquired. Edward had threatened to expose you by week's end. You knew he would be in the garden at that time. He had arranged to meet you there to deliver his ultimatum. You were attempting to create confusion, additional suspects, just as Helena later did with the murder weapon. You can't prove any of this, Lady Selina insisted. Perhaps not conclusively, Miss Marple conceded. But it explains why you fled when Edward's letter was discovered among your possessions. Not just because it implicated you in your husband's death, but because it revealed your own intentions toward Edward that day. Inspector Slack looked intrigued despite himself. Are you suggesting Lady Selina went to the garden intending to murder Crabtree? I believe she went prepared for that possibility. Yes, the garden trowel had been removed from its display case earlier that morning. The housemaid noticed its absence, but Lady Selina never had the opportunity to use it, because she found Edward already dead at Helena's hand. So she took advantage of the situation, Sir Henry suggested, recognized a solution to her problem that required no action on her part, except to ensure that suspicion fell elsewhere. Miss Marple agreed. Hence the note to Lawrence Redding, drawing him to the scene, and later her silence about what she must have witnessed, or at least suspected. Colonel Templeton Green looked at Lady Selina with dawning comprehension. You knew Helena had killed him. You saw her leave the garden. Lady Selina's composure finally cracked. I saw enough to have my suspicions, but why should I have spoken up? Edward's death solved my problem quite neatly, and Helena's desperation made her a useful ally. You helped her plant the murder weapon in my studio, Lawrence realized suddenly. It wasn't Helena alone. She couldn't have accessed my locked studio without help. The gardener's boy saw 2 women entering your studio that afternoon, Miss Marple confirmed. He assumed one was his mistress showing a guest your paintings. In fact, it was Helena and Lady Selina, ensuring that evidence pointed away from them both. Arthur Crabtree leaned forward, his expression pained. So my stepmother killed my father in a moment of rage, and Lady Selina helped cover it up to protect herself from his threats about her husband's death years ago? A succinct summary, Miss Marple nodded. Though I would add that your father had created this web of deceit and manipulation himself. The tragedy is that he spent his final months not making peace with his past, but using it as a weapon, even against his own family. Margaret wiped away a tear. He changed his will to punish us for not accepting his marriage to Helena. He knew how it would look if he died suddenly, that we would suspect her. He wanted us to suffer, even after he was gone. I believe he did, Miss Marple said gently. But knowing this truth, perhaps you can begin to free yourselves from his final manipulation. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. Lady Selina, in light of these revelations, I must ask you to accompany me to the station for further questioning regarding your role as an accessory after the fact. As Lady Selina was led away, her dignified facade finally crumbling, the remaining guests began to disperse. Colonel Templeton Green approached Miss Marple before leaving. How did you know? He asked quietly. About my feelings for Helena, about all of it. Miss Marple smiled slightly. Human nature doesn't vary as much as one might think, Colonel. I observed your interactions with Helena at the garden party, the way you looked at her when you thought no one was watching. It reminded me of young Mr. Sanderson and Miss Green from the village, some years ago. The same careful distance in public, the same meaningful glances, and later your willingness to accept suspicion rather than implicate her. I did love her, he said simply. Despite everything, love can be both our salvation and our downfall, Colonel, Miss Marple replied, rather like the Colonel's Lady Rose, beautiful to behold, but possessing unexpected thorns. As the Colonel took his leave, only Sir Henry remained with Miss Marple in the drawing room. A most satisfactory resolution, he commented, though perhaps not for all parties concerned. Murder resolutions rarely satisfy everyone, Miss Marple observed, gathering her knitting. But at least the truth is known, however painful. Thanks largely to you, Sir Henry acknowledged. Your understanding of human nature once again proved more valuable than all our official methods. Miss Marple smiled modestly. I simply observe and compare, Sir Henry. People are much the same everywhere, whether in St. Mary Mead or London high society. Given similar circumstances, they tend to behave in similar ways. Like your village parallels, Sir Henry smiled. Exactly. This case reminded me so much of the Thoday family dispute over old Mrs. Thoday's will. The surface appearances, a greedy new wife, disinherited children, suspicious death, led everyone to predictable conclusions. Yet the truth lay in the past, in old secrets and resentments that had festered for years. As they left Gossington Hall behind them, the afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the garden, where Edward Crabtree had met his end. The beauty of the setting stood in stark contrast to the dark passions that had played out among its orderly beds and paths. Mary Mead would soon return to its peaceful rhythms, the murder becoming another tale told in hushed voices at tea parties and village gatherings, and Miss Marple would return to her knitting and her garden, her keen eyes ever observant of the little dramas of human nature unfolding around her, waiting patiently for the next time her unique perspective would be needed to unravel the tangled threads of deception and reveal the truth behind another garden gate. A fortnight after the dramatic revelations at Gossington Hall, St. Mary Mead had begun to settle back into its customary rhythms. The murder of Edward Crabtree remained a topic of considerable interest, but discussions had shifted from shocked speculation to retrospective analysis, with various villagers claiming they had suspected something wasn't quite right all along. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a particularly fine morning, enjoying the late June sunshine as she pruned her pink roses. The sound of the garden gate opening caused her to glance up, finding Mrs. Bantry approaching along the path. "Good morning, Jane," her friend called cheerfully. "I thought I might find you among your flowers. Such a perfect day, isn't it? Almost makes one forget the unpleasantness of recent weeks. Nature has a merciful way of continuing, regardless of human dramas," Miss Marple replied, setting aside her secateurs. "Do join me for some tea. I was just about to take a break." Once settled with teacups under the shade of the old apple tree, Mrs. Bantry couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. "I've just come from the village, and everyone's talking about Helena Crabtree's sentencing. Manslaughter rather than murder. It seems rather lenient, doesn't it?" The evidence of her husband's psychological manipulation was quite compelling, Miss Marple observed, and her immediate confession, once confronted, certainly worked in her favor. Still, to think she might be free in just a few years. Mrs. Bantry shook her head. And Lady Selina getting merely a suspended sentence as an accessory. It hardly seems just. "Justice and the law don't always align perfectly," Miss Marple commented, "though I understand Lady Selina still faces potential charges related to her husband's death. Once those investigations conclude, the Colonel has left the village, I hear," Mrs. Bantry continued, helping herself to a scone. "Resigned his commission and gone abroad. Somewhere in the Mediterranean, according to Mrs. Price at the bakery, whose niece works for the travel agency in Much Benham. A wise decision, perhaps," Miss Marple nodded. "Some stains on one's reputation can never be fully removed, especially in a small community like ours. And what of the Crabtree children? Arthur and Margaret. They've decided to sell Wisteria Lodge. Too many painful memories, I imagine. Mr. Petherick tells me they've reached a settlement regarding their father's estate. The courts agreed that the circumstances warranted setting aside the changed will." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice conspiratorially. "And Lawrence Redding? I noticed he called on you yesterday." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Mr. Redding came to say goodbye. He's received a commission in London. Portraits for a banking family. I think he's quite ready to leave St. Mary Mead behind." "Understandable, after being falsely imprisoned for murder," Mrs. Bantry agreed. "Though I must say, Jane, without your insights, the wrong people might have been punished. It's quite remarkable how you saw through all those layers of deception." "Not really," Miss Marple demurred. "It was simply a matter of observing patterns. Helena's behavior reminded me so strongly of Mabel Trilby after her husband's suspicious fall down the stairs. The same careful performance of grief, the same subtle manipulation of others' perceptions. And Lady Selina? How did you determine her involvement? Her hasty departure for London directly after the murder was telling. Innocent people rarely flee a scene of tragedy unless they have something to hide, and there was her convenient return just in time to discover evidence implicating the Colonel." Miss Marple shook her head, so reminiscent of Mrs. Elford during the missing church silver incident, creating diversions to direct attention away from herself. They were interrupted by the arrival of Sir Henry Clithering, who had lingered in the village to tie up loose ends of the investigation. "Ladies, good morning," he greeted them warmly. "I hope I'm not intruding on your tea." "Not at all, Sir Henry," Miss Marple assured him. "We were just discussing the resolution of the Crabtree case." Yes. A most satisfactory conclusion, from an investigative standpoint at least," he said, accepting the offered chair and tea. "Inspector Slack has been unusually complimentary about your contribution, Miss Marple. I believe his exact words were that your interference proved unexpectedly useful." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "High praise indeed from Inspector Slack. I shall treasure it. Gossington Hall is to be sold." "I understand," Sir Henry commented. The estate agent was placing the sign as I walked past. Indeed? So soon after Lady Selina's sentencing? Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. I believe she has no desire to return to St. Mary Mead, Sir Henry replied. Too many uncomfortable associations, and her financial situation is somewhat precarious after the legal proceedings. I wonder who will purchase it, Mrs. Bantry mused. Such a magnificent property deserves appreciative owners. I believe a retired judge and his wife have expressed interest, Sir Henry informed them. Sir William Bedford, you may remember him from the Whitstable forgery case. A most discerning and perceptive gentleman, Miss Marple nodded approvingly. I think he would make an excellent addition to our community. As their conversation continued, touching on various village matters and future plans, Miss Marple found her thoughts drifting back to the tragic events that had disrupted their peaceful existence. Edward Crabtree, so consumed by bitterness and control that he had orchestrated a web of manipulation extending beyond his own death. Helena, driven to a desperate act by years of psychological torment. Lady Selina, preserving her reputation at any cost. The Colonel, blinded by love and self-preservation. A penny for your thoughts, Jane, Mrs. Bantry interrupted her reverie. You've gone quite pensive. I was just reflecting on how the seeds of Edward Crabtree's murder were planted long before he came to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple replied. One deception led to another, then another, until violence seemed the only escape from the tangled web they'd all created. A sobering thought, Sir Henry agreed. Though perhaps there's a lesson in it for us all, that secrets and deceptions, however well buried, have a way of eventually coming to light. Rather like my garden, Miss Marple observed, glancing at her beloved flower beds. One can prune and shape the visible growth, but if the roots are diseased, the problem will inevitably resurface. A most apt analogy, Sir Henry smiled. And speaking of gardens, I understand the village garden competition will be held again next month? A sign of life returning to normal. Indeed, Mrs. Bantry confirmed. Though I believe they've changed the venue to the Vicarage Gardens this year. No one seemed eager to return to Gossington Hall so soon. A sensible decision, Miss Marple agreed. Though I must say, after all this excitement, I shall rather welcome a return to our quiet village routines. After her guests departed, Miss Marple returned to her gardening, finding comfort in the familiar tasks of deadheading and weeding. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, illuminating the church spire and the neat row of cottages along the high street. From her garden, she could hear the distant sounds of everyday life resuming. Children playing, the butcher's van making deliveries, Mrs. Elliot calling her cat in for dinner. Yet, Miss Marple knew that beneath the tranquil surface, human nature remained constant in all its complexity. Passions, jealousies, resentments, and desires continued to simmer, occasionally boiling over into acts that shattered the peace of even the most idyllic settings. And when that happened again, as it inevitably would, she would be there, observing and comparing, drawing on her lifetime of studying the small dramas of village life to illuminate the darker corners of human behavior. For now, though, she was content to tend her roses, to chat with neighbors over the garden fence, and to knit by the fireside in the evenings. St. Mary Mead had weathered its storm of scandal and tragedy. Life continued, altered but unbroken, like a garden recovering after a violent storm, damaged in places but still fundamentally resilient, ready to bloom again when the season turned. As twilight descended, Miss Marple gathered her gardening tools and headed indoors, pausing at her own garden gate to glance back at the peaceful scene. The garden where Edward Crabtree had met his fate was miles away, yet the lessons it had revealed about human nature were as close and familiar as her own carefully tended flower beds. Beautiful on the surface, complex beneath, and always worth careful observation.